Good afternoon. On behalf of the Family Research Council, it's a pleasure to welcome you here. My name is Rob Schwarzwalder. I have the privilege of serving as Senior Vice President here at FRC. It's a real joy and an honor to have Os Guinness speaking with us. Before he begins speaking, let me welcome all of you who are viewing online across the country. I wish you were here to enjoy our delicious lunch, but trust that you will enjoy even more the great lecture we're about to hear. It sounds very cliched, I guess, to say that our speaker today really needs no introduction. In his case, however, it has the advantage of being true. Os Guinness is one of the most distinguished Christian thinkers and writers of our time. He has influenced countless generations or countless numbers of men and women for decades and continues to have that profound influence. Dr. Guinness received his Ph.D. from Oxford University, was a close associate of the late Francis Schaeffer, and his writings on culture, politics, and theology have shaped the way that many of us think about those issues in our time. His new book, Renaissance, addresses how we can effectively reach a culture in an increasingly dark period of time in the West. And so, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and mentor, Os Guinness.
Thank you, Rob. Tremendous pleasure to be back here at the Family Research Council, and I look forward to this, and hello to all of you who are live streaming the event. In June 1940, the Battle of Britain was one of the turning points of World War II. And if you know your history, before the battle and after the battle, Winston Churchill gave two of his greatest speeches. The one before, probably the most famous, ending with the words, "This was their finest hour." But in that speech, there were two sentences earlier that almost nobody mentioned at the time. But after the war was over, they set off a huge debate among Christian thinkers and intellectuals in Europe. What Churchill had said was this: "The Battle of Britain is about to begin. On the outcome of this battle depends the future of Christian civilization." After the war, T.S. Eliot, Jacques Maritain, Emil Brunner, Christopher Dawson, and many, many others of the Christian intellectuals in Europe discussed the question, were the victors really Christian in the way they'd conducted the war? What did it mean for any civilization to claim to call itself Christian? And what were the prospects of restoring Christian culture and civilization in Europe at that time, which is the middle 1940s? Now, we're now 60-odd years beyond that debate. And reading it's absolutely fascinating because you can see they were dead right with their extraordinary sense, which is often lacking today, of the fragility of civilization of any sort. But if they thought that there were serious prospects of restoring it either in Europe or over here, clearly today we're a lot further off even than they thought they were then. Now that debate 60 years ago came back to mind a few years back when there was a huge discussion in Christian circles in this country: can Christians really change the world? You probably remember the debate. On the one side you had those who you might call the blithe optimists. For 50-odd years now, people have said we're changing the world, we're making a difference, we're transforming society. And many, many speeches, many, many books, many, many sermons have referred blithely to that as if it was easy and as if it was happening. On the other hand, you had some that I often call the sour realists who are saying we are not changing the world, and the way we're going about it, we cannot change the world under the advanced modern conditions. And this has become just an empty cliche that should be dropped. Now, I don't know where you stood on that debate, but for myself, I firmly believe that people who've lived the truth of the gospel have and are, in many other parts of the world, and still will again change the world. But the question is why? We can't just say it or leave it at the level of a truism or cliche. We have to explore how, in fact, the Christian faith has been, and in many parts of the world still is, the greatest transforming power individually and socially and culturally. So let me lay out a number of areas that need to be thought through with much greater depth than we have time for today, and ask you to think along with me. First, ponder in your mind the grand global task facing the Christian church in the 21st century. I'm going to be looking mostly at the Western world, but I want you to think of the whole world first and hold it in the back of your mind. The Christian faith is the world's first truly global religion. It's by far the most numerous faith on the earth. The church is the most diverse community on planet Earth. In many parts of the world, the Christian faith is the fastest growing religious movement. And you can see that the scriptures, the Bible, is the most translated and the most translatable book in all human history. It's a moment of extraordinary opportunity for those who are followers of Jesus. But broadly speaking, there are three great challenges or tasks facing the church. The first is to prepare the global south. You probably all know the story of what's happening in the global south, sub-Saharan Africa, Asia. I just happened to be born in north-central China, which is the place that was the epicenter of what's called the fastest growth of the Christian church in 2,000 years. When my parents left China, maybe 750,000 Christians. And today, maybe 70, 80, 90, some say 100 million Christians. And it's said that in 20 years' time, the Christian faith could be the majority faith in China. Now, facts like that are inspiring, they're encouraging, and immensely significant, not only for Christians, but for the entire world. But there's a sting in the tail that many people who know those facts well and cite them often forget. And that is that most of the global south is largely pre-modern. And what's damaged the Western church and reduced it to its shallow and rather feeble state is its capitulation to the challenges of advanced modernity. In other words, their challenge is coming. And you can see in the global south that evangelism has far outstripped discipleship. And even where discipleship is stressed, it's often not in ways that are capable of taking on the challenges of the advanced modern world. Put simply, advanced modernity has done more damage to religion, and certainly to the Christian faith, than all the persecutors in history put together. And part of our task is to help the global south prepare for the challenges that are coming. For example, Christians in rural China have been noted for their extraordinary courage in standing steadfast under the persecution of Mao Zedong. And yet the challenges and seductions of moving, say, to the big cities like Shanghai are far harder even than standing firm under persecution. Prepare the global south. The second challenge is for the Christian faith to reach out and win the Western world back to Jesus. Now, when I say that today, immediately people think of a cultural crusade or a political campaign. That's not what I'm thinking of. I'm certainly not thinking that the West has any superiority. But it does happen to those of us who are followers of Jesus that the West is our Jerusalem. Put in terms of the Great Commission, to those who are our Christian brothers and sisters, say in Korea or in Kenya, we in the West are their uttermost parts of the earth, as they to us are the uttermost parts of the earth. But the West to us is our Jerusalem. And if you think, we are the heirs of two earlier missions to the West. The first, of course, is well known, the conversion of the Roman Empire. A staggering achievement under the Holy Spirit, that the faith that the Romans would have dismissed as a bunch of Judean, Galilean misfits became the faith of Rome itself. And yet when the Western Empire, not the Eastern Empire, when the Western Empire fell, so also did much of the Western Church. And the Dark Ages were extremely dark. But the second mission to the West is what's called the conversion of the barbarian kingdoms. not so well known, but another extraordinary achievement, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, and the beginning of what came, for better or worse, Christendom. And I'm proud as an Irishman to say that's maybe Ireland's greatest hour, contributing to that second mission to the West, and missionaries like Columbanus coming down in flimsy coracles to France and right down throughout Europe, and the trail of Celtic crosses is evident still today. But we need to think that instead of the gloom and doom in this country, we need to win our friends, neighbors, colleagues, and much of the cultural spheres of the country back to the vision of human flourishing represented in the good news of Jesus. Not as a cultural crusade, not as a political campaign, but winning people and their whole spheres to Christ again. And thirdly, the third task I think we need to consider is to contribute to the human future. You who are the rising generation are sometimes called the crunch generation, in the sense that in the global era, now many of the world's issues are converging to create a crunch of issues which will have to be solved in your adulthood, or humankind is in for rough sailing. And you can see that this will require thinking out of worldviews, thinking out of ethical commitments. And the question is, which faiths, which philosophies, which worldviews, which ethical commitments are up to the challenge of these great human issues that are being raised? And I would argue that many of them cannot be answered within the frameworks of, say, Hinduism or Buddhism or even the new atheism. And the deepest answers will be found in the Jewish and Christian understanding of life and humanity. Hold that in the background as we think more of the West. Secondly, consider the somewhat surprising relationship of the Christian faith to culture and civilization. Obviously, the Christian faith is unnecessary for culture or civilization. What is a culture? What's a civilization? Before I go further. A culture, put very simply, is a way of life lived in common. So we can talk about a teenage culture, or a hippie culture, or a French culture, or the Korean culture, or whatever. A way of life lived in common. Jesus called individuals to be his followers, but he didn't call them to live individualistically. He called them to be the followers of his way and to be a community that expressed that way. And naturally, Christians living the way of Jesus produced a Christian culture. What's a civilization? A civilization, put simply, is a culture with sufficient extension, it spreads wide enough, sufficient duration, it lasts long enough, and sufficient above all elevation. It achieves in some area prowess which humans admire down the centuries. Now, if you think of the great 9 civilizations of history, which we needn't go into, you can see that the West is the only one touched by the Christian faith. In other words, there have been great civilizations. I grew up in China and great admirer of some of the Chinese dynasties. Equally, growing up in England, where our admiration is for the Greeks, rather than the American admiration for the Romans, our admiration for the Greeks, what an extraordinary civilization they produced, however brief it lasted. And they were not in any way Christian. They didn't have the scriptures, and they certainly didn't know, because they preceded Jesus. So it's no surprise to us who are followers of Jesus that humans made in the image of God are capable of greatness in all sorts of areas, even if they don't know him, even if they are opposed to him, as many are today. Secondly, though, you might say, the Christian faith is unlikely looking to produce a great civilization. Our Lord says in John 8, I am not of this world. 10 chapters later, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. He doesn't address many of the issues on the front pages of the Washington Post or the New York Times. He renounces force which any civilization needs to preserve itself, let alone to prevail. And yet, it's undeniable that the Christian faith was the decisive factor in one of the world's great civilizations. Yes, we all know we owe a great deal to the Greeks. And you can think of all the debts we owe to them. We owe a great deal to the Romans, and the same would be true of them. But if you look at many of the distinctive features of the West, directly or indirectly, they owe everything to the Scriptures and to Jesus of Nazareth. Take, for example, our great culture of giving and caring and philanthropy. How that atheist historians even say the parable of the Good Samaritan is the parable that changed the world. No other civilization has anything like it. Or take the Western tradition of recurring reforms that certainly go back to the prophets like Amos, but achieve so much of their motivation directly from Jesus himself. From the banning of infanticide, the gladiatorial games, the oppressions of the conquistadores, the abolition of slavery, right down to the civil rights movement and the Reverend Martin Luther King, you can see that almost all the great movements of reform in the West were inspired by faith in Jesus and led by followers of Jesus. Or take, thirdly, the rise of the universities. I go down to our library in Oxford, and you see the Oxford motto, the Latin, for Psalm 27:1, "The Lord is my light above all the places that people are studying." And there's no question that the great universities owe something to Plato's Academy. Maybe something to the Al-Azhar Mosque, but their primary foundation out of the cathedral schools. Or fourthly, the rise of modern science. Obviously, ancient science, we owe everything to the Greeks, and much of it kept alive by the Muslims. But modern science, the Matrix, the Reformation. And of course, most recently, the human rights movement. Not in debt to the Enlightenment, but to people who are sure that people should not be oppressed because they were made in the image of God and therefore had a precious and inalienable dignity. And whether it's Las Casas against the conquistadores or Wilberforce against slavery and so on, you can see that that was rooted in a Jewish and Christian understanding of human dignity. And strikingly today, many of our atheist friends are unable to justify the full grounding for human dignity in the 21st century. So you can see that it's undeniable that while it's unlikely in many ways, there's no question that the Christian faith has a direct and indirect link to many of the strongest and most noble features of our Western world. Thirdly, though, and I don't cover this in the book, we need to face up today to what you might call the meltdown or the black hole of advanced modernity. I was in Congress a few years back, and a congressman put up his hand after I talked and said, "If there's a flood, a small boy can put a finger in the dike and be a hero. But I'm looking out in America on a landslide." 4 political leaders had said something like that to me in the last year, 2 of them in the British Parliament. What's behind that sense of mudslide or meltdown or black hole? If you go back to Marx, who's no hero of mine, but he did say something fascinating way back in the 1840s. All that is sacred, he said in the Communist Manifesto, is being profaned. All that is solid is melting into air. And he's referring to the impact of our rising industrial age. Nietzsche said something similar. When God dies in a culture, the culture becomes weightless, light as air. One of the greatest modern analysts of our society uses the metaphor liquid. At point after point after point, things that were solid in terms of convictions and ideals, like freedom, are melting and then evaporating and becoming as light as air. You think of Milan Kundera, the unbearable lightness of being. Now, what's behind this? You can call it fancy terms like a crisis of cultural authority, the way, even in America, ideas and ideals which were so compelling, say in the Revolution and in years afterwards, are becoming meaningless and cliches and as light as air. My own guess, along with others, is that you can see under the conditions of advanced modernity three things that are kind of evaporating many of our strongest convictions. 3 R's. First, the relativizing of certainties. Take the impact of extreme postmodernism, Jacques Derrida's term, everything is, quote, undecidable. The relativizing of certainties, including truth claims. Secondly, the range of choices. As the choices multiply, and choice and choosing itself is seen as the act of freedom, everything becomes one more choice, preference, whim, not something of deep convictions. And thirdly, the rapidity of change. With everything passing so fast in our technological advances, you can see that everything becomes ephemeral and light as air. And the challenge, whether we're talking politically about freedom and justice and other convictions like that, or we're talking about faith, the challenge is to have such views with such integrity that they can prevail over this effect of the black hole or the meltdown of advanced modernity. Fourthly, explore what it was that is the transforming power of the Christian faith in history. Some Christians immediately dismiss that. Of course, it's God's power, and they stop the question there. But we can see in the Scripture, God is sovereign, but we as humans are significant, and there's always a partnership. We are the junior partners, but we're significant, and we're responsible. And it's up to us to play our junior, though humble, part. And what is it that we do on our side? It's to so live the gospel, live the truth in practice, that it does become powerful. But how? Many people have tried to explore this. C.S. Lewis's famous answer was that the Jewish and Christian faiths are unique in what he called their blessedly two-edged character. They are both simultaneously world-affirming and world-denying. Some faiths are world-affirming. For example, Confucianism in China, or modern secularism. They're world-affirming. After all, they only have this world, so they affirm it. There are other faiths that are world-denying. Buddhism has been described as the most gigantic no to human aspirations ever delivered. Now, Boomer Buddhism in California is a rather distorted view, but Buddha's own position, far more radical, world-denying, just as secularism is world-affirming. But, says Lewis, the Christian faith is both. Because of the doctrine of creation, a world that was made good, very good, the Christian faith is world-affirming. And we produced cathedrals and art and music and universities and many other things that express a positive view of life and the world, but world-denying. Christians have fasts as well as feasts. There is sacrifice as well as joy. And Lewis argues it's that blessedly double-edged character of the Christian faith which gives it such extraordinary cultural strength. I think St. Augustine is even deeper, with his great notion of the city of God and the city of man. Now you remember St. Augustine is not only arguing against the pagans who were saying Rome had become Christian and therefore was enfeebled, and the Christian Roman Empire was unable to run the stern business of a massive empire. He was also arguing against the Christians, many of whom in his day had colluded Rome and the kingdom so that they were one. And they'd forgotten the challenge of being in the world, but not of the world. And his great reminder is that those who are followers of Jesus, who love God before they love themselves, are those who are in the city of God within the city of man. In other words, there should be a tension there. So the challenge is living, as Jesus put it, in the world, but not of the world. Now, obviously, there are two extremes. We can be in the world and of the world, and so worldly that the church is weak. Or we can be so purist that we're not of the world at all and not in it, and equally weak because we're not engaged. Now, what does it take truly to be in, but not of? Well, first, it takes engagement. That's no challenge to you here. You are an engaged group. But every follower of Jesus should be so engaged. There's not an option there. We're called to be in it, although not of it. Secondly, and this isn't so common, it takes discernment. Engaged in the world, we have to know when the world is helpful and beneficial and gives us gifts that can be used, or when it's harmful and opposed to the kingdom of our Lord. Now, discernment in much of the Christian community is very limited. Many Christians, for example, could be aware of false ideas at 100 yards. Secularism or relativism and things like this. But in terms of the seductions or the challenges of the advanced modern world, consumerism and many, many other things, they're hardly aware of that at all, because people don't analyze culture the way they analyze ideas. And many Christians have been infiltrated extraordinarily deeply at the levels of culture who would be openly opposed to ideas when they come across them. But thirdly, it takes engagement, it takes discernment, it takes courage. Now again, that's Coles to Newcastle to you here at the Family Research Council. But much of the church today in America is weak because it lacks the courage to be different and to clearly make a stand when the culture is an emerging majority that is not only different from us, but is highly disdainful of us and deeply opposed to us in many ways. We're at an Athanasian moment. Athanasius contra mundum. And that takes courage. And it takes the ability to know how to live differently and to articulate with persuasion a positive and persuasive alternative vision of human flourishing. If that's the secret, though, in, not of, so that there's a tension with the culture, when the church lives that way in reality, that tension becomes creative and culture shaping. And the church is truly salty and light-bearing and changes the world. Now we have to say in America, although the great majority of Americans would claim still to be Christians, followers of Jesus, the very fact that for all their numbers they have such a weak cultural influence compared with groups that are 1 or 2% of Americans shows that the basic problem of the church in America is that it's weak because it's worldly. It's in the world, it's of the world, it's neither speaking differently nor living differently in a way that's salty enough and light-bearing enough to really make a difference. Fifthly, and I tend to forget my numbers when I go down. I don't forget what I'm trying to say, but I forget the numbers. We need to explore the secrets of the advances of the kingdom. The church grows and the kingdom spreads in its own way. Now, we're at a fascinating moment in history where good scholarship in the universities shows us today how ideas change cultures. You can read books like Randall Collins' The Sociology of Philosophies. Long book, heavy book, not one to drop on your toe or take to a beach, but a magnificent analysis of how ideas, whether it's Chinese culture, Egyptian culture, Greek culture, French culture, American culture, how ideas change societies. And as you know, if you've read that or people have popularized him, he argues that it's through leaders rather than followers. It's through the center of a culture rather than the periphery. And it's through networks rather than just individuals, or certainly rather than institutions. Now, his ideas are right. They're accurate. And we can learn an immense amount from them, and there are people who are translating those down into Christian terms, which is very valuable. But there's nothing expressly Christian about them, whereas we need to understand also, not as opposed to that, also how the kingdom spreads. And we can see that in the scriptures themselves, and we can see it down through history when the church has at times been powerful. I would put forward 3 ways in which we need to add to the secular understanding a Christian understanding of the secrets of the growth of the kingdom. First, It is God who leads through his Spirit. If we look at the early church, how did the gospel get to Africa? The Spirit of God speaks to Philip, sends him to meet the Ethiopian official, and he reaches Africa before the good news came to Europe. How did it come to Europe? If we read the book of Acts, Europe was not in St. Paul's, quote, next steps. He wanted to go to Bithynia, Asia Minor. He's checked, blocked, frustrated. And it's then that he sees this vision of the man from Macedonia calling him to help, and he concludes the Spirit is sending him not to Asia Minor, but to Europe. And as one historian says, when that unknown rabbi crosses from Troas to Philippi, he puts more of a stamp on world history than the great sea battle of Actium, which took place a few miles from where he crossed. The Spirit led. Most of us today are Gentiles. Peter did not have us in mind. We were the dogs. We were the unclean. But it was the Spirit of God who blasted apart his prejudices in that great vision and sent him down to the centurion, and the gospel comes to the Gentiles. And you can see again and again. Now, why is that important? In our modern world, we think of everything sort of McKinsey style. Vision, mission, timeline, personnel, budget, next steps, and of course at the bottom, measurable outcomes. Get your yellow pad, you can put a man on the moon, you can market a perfume, you can grow a church, thinking in that way. But we have such actually a secularized form of thinking that we're in many cases out of touch with the guidance of the one who leads the advance of what after all is his kingdom, not ours. Or a second secret you can see down through history is the role of surprising reversals. A feature of the kingdom of Jesus, as he announces it, the first last, the humble exalted. People who want to be great have to be servants of all, and so it goes. It's the upside down, back to front, wrong way round kingdom. And you often see that's the way God moves. Not the people we would expect, the last person we would expect, and God's using them. And we have to be humble enough always to be open to the people and the ways that God himself is moving. Not our ways, but his ways, which are far higher than our ways. And the third thing you can see is that great culture is usually a byproduct, not a goal. Many people today, realizing that Christian faith is ineffectual in the arts and in many other places, are talking about building great art movements and so on. But you can see down through history that isn't the way it happens. Again, it's not strategic thinking and planning, but people who are doing their utmost for God's highest in their callings. So yes, there are exceptions. For many of us, William Wilberforce is an extraordinary example. He was actually a friend of my great-great-grandfather, who was one of his strongest financial supporters. But you know, Wilberforce died 3 days after slavery was abolished. So from 28 to his early 70s, he's pursuing this great goal, and 3 days after it's abolished, he dies, and someone says in his memorial, how remarkable, the termination of his life and the termination of his labors coincided. But that's very rare. Great influence through faith is much more like Hebrews 11. People who by faith saw things that went over the horizon of their lifetimes, but they were prepared to risk everything in that vision and ventures of faith. And God, who saw them do it, prepared a city for them because they were worthy of his calling, knowing that the great things we're aiming for may not happen in our lifetime. As Reinhold Niebuhr says, over many of our greatest ventures, we have to put the word incomplete. But we're doing them by faith to God's glory, with the outcome that we may never see. So you can see someone like Johann Sebastian Bach. He doesn't set out to be what we see him as, a genius. No, rather to exercise his gifts in the sphere of his calling, which is music. And he writes in the score of his music, "Glory be to the Lamb," and so on. And the net effect of his faithfulness in his calling was the great music we look back to from Johann Sebastian, but the same would be true of lawyers and politicians and people in all the spheres of life. Much of the greatest contribution to Christian culture is as a byproduct, not a goal. The kingdom is the goal. Seek first the kingdom of God, and these things are added. Or as T.S. Eliot put in that debate I mentioned, you don't build a tree, you plant a tree. And as he pointed out, all the pictures Jesus uses of the kingdom are organic, not organizational. And we need to realize how it is that the kingdom actually spreads. Sixthly and lastly, we need to learn from 2,000 years of Christian engagement with culture. You'd think that after 20 centuries, we would be the wisest generation of Christians there are. We can see all the mistakes, all the best, all the worst, and avoid all the pitfalls. But do we? Probably not. Well, history is strewn with lessons. Let me just mention 3 paradoxical lessons that you can see from this long engagement of the Christian church with culture. First, periods of the greatest success often breed the worst failures. Take Christendom. Christendom was the world's first attempt at a consistently Christian culture. What a magnificent opportunity, and what a noble goal. And great things came out. You take, say, the music or the architecture, and many, many other things, particularly in the areas of thought. But we have to say with candor, out of Christendom also came the worst evils that Christians have ever perpetrated on the world. From the excesses of the Crusades, to the Inquisition, to the slaughter of the Albigensians, to coerced baptism of the Jews, to the pogroms, and so on. All of them out of Christendom. Why? Well, you can see why if you go back, say, to an early historian of Christendom. He says, and he was thinking of St. Augustine, I set about writing the story of 2 cities. But I've realized after I got into this that I'm actually only writing the story of 1 city, the city of God, Christendom. He'd lost the tension. In, but not of. And if we ever think we've arrived and we lose that tension between us and the culture, then you lose prophetic critique. And Christendom developed a world that was Christian and hermetic and stifled all debate and dissent, and in things like the Index of Errors, was a form of intellectual oppression which was appalling. And it had no Amos, no Jeremiah, no Isaiah, and it became corrupt. And you can see something like, say, the born-again movement in America. For better or worse, never had any prophetic critique. And with all the triumphalism that flowed out of it, you can see the corruption that came in there, and now the huge anti-Christian backlash against it, part of which, sadly, is justified. Second paradoxical lesson is that the darkest hours always are just before the dawn. That sounds like a cliche, but it's true. And in a way, that's the story of every single revival. 5 minutes before revival breaks out, the landscape looks bleak. Take, say, the 1790s and Thomas Jefferson predicting that evangelicalism would disappear and Unitarianism would triumph as the sun of reason would rise through the Enlightenment. Stupid things like evangelicals would disappear. Then, within a year or two, the Second Awakening. Unitarianism almost disappeared, and evangelicalism was the primary dynamism of the early 19th century. In other words, any gloom and doom today is totally unwarranted. We have incredible challenges, humanly as well as in many, many other areas. But we should be waiting for the Lord to speak and act. And when he does, you can see everything changes in moments. The third paradoxical lesson, a little more controversial, and certainly counterintuitive, the church always goes forward best by going back first. Now, why does that need to be said? If you look at the faces of time in our modern world, the past, the present, the future, in the past, people focused on the past. They didn't know much about the present. Their own small village maybe, their own town maybe, but not the rest of the world. They knew nothing about the future. But now, we've almost retired the past. And now we have instant total information about the present, and we have our futurists telling us what's coming. So for us, it's that moment when the future becomes the present, sees the urgent now, and you got it made, politically, commercially, or whatever. And so the latest is greatest. The relevant is the key thing, etc., etc. That's not the way the church goes forward. If you think for a moment, two of the greatest movements of ideas in our Western world were the Renaissance and the Reformation. Both of them were movements of recovery. Something was wrong, and they went back. The Renaissance to the roots of classical learning, the Reformation back to Jesus, back to the Scriptures, back to St. Paul, and so on. They went forward powerfully by going back first because something was wrong and something was missing. And instead of this craze always to be up to date, in touch with the latest thing, or we'll be left behind technologically or theologically or whatever, you can see the church, when it's weak or has gone wrong, always goes forward best by going back first. In other words, we have to say, if we're as weak as we are today, something must be wrong. Either something's wrong with the good news of Jesus, or something's wrong with us. And I hope we're humble enough to say which it is. Now, what does this mean? In that debate, 60 years ago, they raised the question, what were the prospects of a Christian awakening again? Or as the great Catholic historian Christopher Dawson put it, can the church be warmed again a third time? The conversion of Rome, the collapse in the Dark Ages, the conversion of the barbarian kingdoms, and here we are centuries later in the twilight of that second great mission to the West. What are the prospects for restoring things again? Now, some of those in the debate were candid. Emil Brunner, the Swiss theologian, said, I am not sure it can happen. And he outlines very realistically the challenges facing the church as he saw it in the 1940s, and they're far greater today than they were then, and they're not only in Europe as they were then, they're over here in the United States too today. Christopher Dawson, though, he argued with more confidence. And he puts it like this: can the church be warmed again a third time? He said every Christian would probably say yes. But, he warns, we mustn't answer too quickly or too lightly, because on the outcome of that answer could depend the future of humanity. In other words, in this crunch era, with these grand global issues facing humanity, which faith is capable of giving answers rooted in human dignity, liberty, equality, responsibility, and many, many other things which would be necessary to answer these great questions? And his conviction, and mine too, would be that there are no answers so deep, as well as open to being seen as true, as those we have in the Christian faith. So that while most of your discussion, I imagine, at FRC is much more on political and cultural things, those of us who are followers of Jesus need to take seriously that part of the problem is us. We need a renewal and reformation of the integrity and effectiveness of faith lived out today, so that on the one hand it may be able to prevail over the challenges of modernity, and on the other hand it may be able, humbly but creatively, to contribute to the huge questions facing humanity in the future. Thank you.
I failed to mention in my introduction that we are taking questions by Twitter. What is the hashtag, Nathan? I beg your pardon? At FRCDC. So if you have questions online for Dr. Guinness, please feel free to send them in, and I'll turn the podium back over to him for your questions.
Okay, if you have questions, please raise your hand and wait until I give you the mic so that our online viewers can hear.
Hi, it was the Reverend Billy Graham who made a statement to the effect of that the next great awakening in America was likely to happen through the marketplace. I was curious if you would comment about that.
I don't know the context of what you're saying. You mean in the marketplace or through the marketplace or what?
I took it to mean because we are such a consumer-driven society, to that effect.
Mm-hmm. Billy's a good friend, so I'm not commenting on what he said, but let's look at the marketplace as a whole. I think consumerism per se, that's not capitalism. In other words, in the 20th century, free market capitalism changed in two ways. One was what's called financialization, the shift from the so-called real economy of the corporations and so on to Wall Street, the City of London, and so on. That's a huge, I'm not referring to that. The other shift was the rise of consumerism. I am personally appalled as a social scientist. If you look at the rise of consumerism, 1915, 20, early 30s, many of those who were pushing it, in other words, for the first time in history, production was outstripping consumption, so you had to have marketing and consumerism to come in to bolster it. But many of its architects, its visionaries, its thinkers, were specifically attacking the Protestant ethic and the whole Christian understanding of money and spending. And I'm amazed that Christian preachers and thinkers and others back in that time didn't answer it, because that's one of the main reasons why the Christian faith in this country has been undermined by the power of consumerism. So I don't look to consumerism per se to answer. I would put the problem like this. Capitalism is clearly the greatest engine of wealth creation in history, no question. And its alternatives like socialism, communism are a disaster. But capitalism requires human values, ethical values, and character. And if it lacks that, it will create self-destructive trends, which it is doing in America, and it lacks the thing that faith needs to supply. And so you have something very similar to what you have with political freedom. In other words, the framers' understanding of freedom required and assumed faith, and without it, freedom will just run into the sands of permissiveness and undermine itself. And the same thing, I think, will be true of capitalism. So I don't know what Billy meant. I'm not attacking what he said. But I think we need what you might call a critical but creative, supportive critique of capitalism. It needs the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, very profoundly.
Tertullian said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." In our current era with ISIS and a lot of the violence going on, we actually see a lot of apathy. And I'm wondering if the time we're in, we've become so indifferent to violence that not even the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church anymore. Could you answer that?
In China, some people in the West glorify persecution. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. It's true in the early church. And it's certainly true, say, in China, which is the part of the world where persecution goes on that I know the best. I remember as a 9-year-old, I was in Nanjing, as it is now, when the first wave of terror started, and my parents were in touch with many of the people imprisoned, executed, and so on. So I know little of the Chinese situation, and that is certainly true there. We have tended to go from a romantic view of persecution. Persecution is savage. And now it's a shift, though, with the mounting dislike of Christians and the definite discrimination in the West here and there. We've gone to portraying ourselves as persecuted, and we now are the victims, which is equally wrong. So we must never romanticize persecution. But we are not being persecuted in the way that the early church was, the Chinese Christians were, they were in Rwanda, or whatever. We're not. And it's a great and fatal danger for Christians ever to portray the victim card or to play the phobia card. And I intensely oppose this book and the new movement that we should call people who oppose us Christianophobes or Christophobes. Always those who portray the victim card come to see themselves as victims, and in the long run they paralyze themselves as victims. And we as followers of Jesus, anyone follow me, let him take up his cross and follow me. We should be the most broad-shouldered people in the world who expect insults. Now, your point is a good one too, though. Americans have seen so much violence that's unreal on television and other places that they're not touched as we would have been, in the past. So we've got to be very, very careful of that. Now, there are all sorts of other factors. And the present administration, because of its reluctance to call a spade and to use the word Islam about movements that are extreme Islam, are pussyfooting around the terms and so on and failing to do a serious analysis of what's gone wrong. So there are many, many factors. But we've got to be very clear. Persecution does stiffen and brace and bring out the deepest courage, but we must never describe things as persecution which frankly aren't.
We have a question from Twitter. What role has Christian education played in periods of revival? Like Christian education is in schooling of Christian children from a Christian worldview.
Take a movement like that I mentioned, like the conversion of the barbarian kingdoms. The missionaries, say, from Ireland, which was then called the land of saints and scholars. Certainly not where Ireland is today, I'm afraid. Anyway, they took the gospel, the scriptures, literacy, and education. And that, of course, was one of the key things that sowed the seeds that became Christendom and eventually led to the rise of the universities. So there's no question that whether it's the broader missionary movement today, wherever Christian missions has been at its best. I'm a missionary kid. So I grew up as a student in the 60s, used to the insults, missionary movements are all colonialism and all this sort of stuff. All the best scholarship today shows that where Christian missions were at their best, you have the best of education, of medicine, of the seeds of democracy, and so on. So you take China. The very best universities in China are Christian institutions. So we've got to get over the residual anti-intellectualism of much of the American church. All truth is God's truth. We think in believing, as Augustine said, and we believe in thinking. And we should be unashamed and wholehearted in our commitment to education. We fear no questions. We'll face any challenges. We don't individually have all the answers, but we are in favor of truth, and we're in favor of education, and we're in favor of good scholarship. And we need to exhibit that at every level of Christian education today. Question from the front.
Yeah, it just occurred to me, thinking of the Roman Empire and now China, I guess the parallel hadn't occurred to me before. Would you care to comment on any sort of comparing and contrasting between Christian culture growing in China and perhaps ultimately subsuming Chinese society, similar to Christianity growing in the Roman Empire and ultimately subsuming the Roman Empire in an evangelistic manner?
Well, if you remember what I said earlier, that, a month or so ago when statistics came out saying in 20 years' time the Christian faith could be a majority faith, I was asked, among others, what I thought of that. And one point I made, in light of what I said earlier, Christians will then face a greater challenge of popularity than they did of persecution. Now, a number of years ago, I was at university, which will be unmentioned, in China, at the Academy of the Social Sciences, and the question of the day was this: which faith would replace Marxism as an ideology? And they said quite candidly, the party is in power, the ideology is dead. Which would it be? And they ran through the options. China could be nationalistic, and that would be dangerous for the world. Or the Chinese could be just materialistic, and Chinese make pretty good materialists. That wouldn't have a huge impact on the world except for the rise of consumerism. Or they could go back to Confucianism, but Confucianism is somewhat elitist. Or they could try and reform and revive Buddhism, But as I said, Buddhism is essentially world-denying, or the last option could be the Christian faith. In other words, Buddhism is an import, so it's no less an import than the Christian faith in China. But we need to have Christians who not only have a strong commitment to Jesus and understanding his way of life, but really understand modernity as the Chinese will be developing it, and we're not doing very well at that in the West. So that will be their extraordinary challenge. If they do it, the impact could be quite extraordinary. Another time, I was at a university in Singapore, and we had a discussion afterwards with academic respondents and so on, and one man said, well, this gentleman is American, we're Asian. I'm not actually American, European, but he said, we don't want the American way, we want the Asian way. And we don't want Christ, we want Confucius. He said, look at our Chinese family. We're doing much better than the American family. Look at its chaos. My response was, yes, the American family is in chaos, but not because it's American, but because it's modern. And when you modernize, you will have the same challenges. And you can see in China today, the government has brought in the alpha marriage course because they're so aware that the Chinese family, which traditionally has been the strength of China, is breaking down. Say, children caring for their parents and all these sort of practical things which are so important. So the problems we have in the West are happening in China, not because they're following America, but they're becoming modern too. So the questions for Christians in China, will they have a vibrant faith, but an understanding, discerning faith that wrestles with these huge issues of the advanced modern world? And there are some. I've spoken to, academics and Christians in Beijing who are really wrestling with some of these things, but relatively few.
One more question. Your comment about the member of Congress who felt his or her struggle so strongly, differently against the sort of melting away trend in the country, or what you said about Nietzsche and Marx with industrial age and the death of God, their struggle, their felt sense melting away against something. Would you comment a little bit further on what kinds of norms you would encourage for Christians who feel a sense of calling or struggle against something, without doing that in a way that's honorable, but that doesn't make it somehow ultimate in an unhealthy way?
I'm, to be really candid, groping to understand the phenomenon. And when I put it with those 3 R's, they're just words unless you start thinking of them. That's my best attempt so far. The radical relativizing, the range of options and rapidity of change and this sort of black hole, so that convictions go into it just come out as cliches and things that have no compelling power. Now, to counter it, you need at least 4 things. 1, people who discern the challenge. 2, people who have an alternative vision of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. 3, a deep sense of personal calling, because something general won't make that much difference. Each of us has to know, this is my gift, these are my callings, this is my sphere, I will do my utmost for his highest here, and trust that you'll do yours there, and Rob's doing his there, and Andrew's doing his, etc., etc. Each of us, you've got to have that sense of deep personal calling. But then the 4th thing, we need friends who form that network. Collins calls it dense network. We need friends for that accountability who will inspire us and encourage us. And, we all get beaten up. Times you wonder, can it be done? And we need friends who'll hold our feet to the fire. I'm in my 70s. I came to faith when I was in my 20s. Any old fool can have vision and idealism when you're 25. But when you've been beaten down and battered 1,000 times and the things you've tried for just look absolutely impossible. And I even take something like religious freedom. From the first time I've been in this country, I've fought for that. No initiative I've been involved in has made that much difference. You need friends to inspire and encourage and hold your feet. You're not going to back out now. and so on. So I think those are the four things. We need people with radical discernment. They can. Some would say I read a lot of the political stuff from Christian circles that comes across the wire every day. Some is just plain wrong in its description of what's gone wrong. A lot of it's just plain simplistic. The problems of we need people with a genuinely radical discernment of where we are and what's gone wrong, then that high vision generally, the specifics of a personal calling, and then a group of friends who will inspire and encourage you. And then by God's grace, we'll all throw in our half cents worth, and we leave to the Lord the outcome. We have no idea what it'll be.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Guinness.
Thank you.